everybody, welcome to another episode from the DJ1 series, bringing you the best in Southeast Asian history week in, week out. 1 week closer to the CTs. I hope that you guys are hanging in there and doing well. We are just about done with National Unity and then we can begin our revision. The DJ1 podcast series will continue to provide you all these valuable goodies, preparing you for the CTs and beyond. It's great to have you guys back again in this podcast. Thank you for always conscientiously listening in and contributing in class. Really do appreciate that. Having that sense of conversation and hearing from you guys always brings joy to my heart. Today, as I record this, at the time of my recording actually, it has been a few hours since Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, PM Lee Hsien Loong, has dissolved Parliament. And therefore we know that a general elections is coming, and that date will be on July 10th. So let it go down in history that this podcast is on this day itself where the announcement was made. I just want you guys to... It's great that this has happened this year and you guys are in J1 and we've just covered, the topic of political stability. You guys are history students. In a sense, you're going to be living in history as well. You're going to be having a stake in this. You were there at the 2020 elections in a crisis situation while general elections is still going on. I mean, historical landmarks, certainly this is one of it. I want you guys to really pay close attention from today onwards, all the way to polling day, all the way to when the election results are released. I really want you guys to pay attention to the political process. You guys are now woke. Yeah, get woke, son. Like, you guys are now woke already with regards to how politics work. And we've been really looking at democracy and its features, its processes, its principles, its outcomes, but also some of its limitations and some of its failings. Observe these things as you go through the next month or so. See your history content coming to life. A lot of the things that we saw with Singapore or with Southeast Asia democracy in our syllabus is going to come alive for you if you just be sharp and pay attention to what's going around you. Try and connect it to your syllabus or your understanding of democracy and see how it goes. Guys, it is really an exciting time, election period. I remember my first elections when I really got woke. I was in uni. At that point in time, I still couldn't vote yet, but I was in uni and I attended, the various election rallies, from the PAP rallies to the opposition rallies and so on and so forth. And I just was really immersed in the process and it really, really opened my eyes. It was a really special time for me because I got to attend all these rallies and all that with my father. And my father is a huge inspiration to me because he's that kind of like working class hero that rose from, started at the bottom, look where we at, rose to the top, that kind of stuff. And he just taught me so much about politics as I was growing up. And then I finally got to see, what it was like lah. Of course, this election is going to be a bit different. You don't have that kind of mass rallies and all that kind of stuff, but I think you can still observe a lot of things. And I do suggest that we be aware of what's going on. We observe things and we can bring them to class. We can have a discussion. You can ask me hey Mr. Koh, why was this or hey Mr. Koh, why Singapore's democratic system, electoral process is like that? Hey, how come there's this feature here? Hey, how come that kind of stuff? So exciting times. I myself will be voting and I'll be keeping up to track with all the latest what's what and what's going on in the scene over there. Today, however, we are going to be continuing our national unity study, and today I'm going to go into two case studies, Malaysia and Indonesia. I thought it would be a nice grouping. I haven't really done this before, but I thought it would be a nice grouping to look at two Malay states, Malay Muslim states, in one lecture and to see what kind of connections we can make. Every year I try to switch things up a bit, so this year this is something a bit new. Let's see what we can switch things up a bit. The other reason why I chose Indonesia and Malaysia is because I still want to leave Thailand and Philippines alone. So that is still up for tutorial discussions as what I mentioned last week. So more instructions on that later at the end of the podcast for Thailand and Philippines. But for today, we are going to go into Malaysia and Indonesia and see the national unity efforts over there. Remember, our two big questions still remain, okay? What kind of approaches did they use? And did it change over time? Did it change with the leaders? Did it change with the context? So what kind of approaches did they use? That is our first big question. The second big question is, in these countries, was national unity achieved? So it'll be a good time right now for you to recap and to bring up your national unity indicators. You can keep them alongside with you now as you go through the lecture, so we can tie the indicators to the content and see, what's your assessment of these two case studies in terms of national unity. A last note before I begin today's lecture and content is that the CTs, I released the instruction sheet already, and over there I did indicate to you specifically that there will be one question on political stability and another question on national unity. So national unity, whatever we are going through now and these few lessons, will be relevant if you choose to strategize and to expertise in national unity, then all these things will be good for you lah. If you choose to expertise in political stability, please have a plan B situation. Know enough about national unity such that if you can't do the political stability question, at least you got a plan B situation. Okay, so strategize in this manner. Without further ado, let's begin. Same thing, this is the syllabus document extracting out. It's the same as previous lecture stuff. The focus is the two main questions that I told you just now. So if you need though the syllabus document stuff, this is it. But yeah, I really want to go into Indonesia first, looking at this case study. Indonesia is a really, really complex case study. It's one of the most difficult case studies to judge national unity. And a lot of this complexity stems from its foundations. And its foundations you can see over here, from its geographical makeup, from its demographical makeup, from its ethnographical makeup. It's just so complex. It's an archipelago. It is many islands, big and small, coming together in one single unit, one single territory. Each of these islands or each of these land territories, there are a variety of different groups of people there, and coming together in one single united country, well, it's always going to be a massive task. You can see that Indonesia, the way it is structured as a state, geographically speaking, it is really long. So any government, right, who is based in Java, who is based in Jakarta, has this immense task, not only in governing Java in itself or Jakarta, but in the outer islands as well. And guys, again, keep in mind that many of these countries that we are looking at, geographically speaking, they are not like Singapore. These are massive countries. You just got to try to relate it to your own personal experience on geographical size. I don't know how many of you have taken a drive trip or a bus trip down to Malaysia, and just from JB to KL, that's a drive trip of 5 hours long. And again, Malaysia is considered one of the smaller countries in Southeast Asia. So if that in itself is just 5 hours long from JB to KL, think of, something like this, massively, like, Indonesia. Jakarta in itself is just a massive place, and it's just really a difficult task, foundationally speaking, structurally speaking, to govern these kind of things. Looking at the ethnicity and the dispersion over there in Indonesia, the dominant group are the Javanese, of which a lot of Indonesian culture is based upon. So it's one of those situations where the dominant group has a greater assertion and a greater stake in what eventually became national identity. So you can see over here Javanese, and then they're like, again, this demographics over here you see is condensed down to a really small number, but keep in mind that within the Indonesian archipelago, there's a lot more ethnic diversity that's going on over there. So dominant group, definitely we can see over there. But you can see that with the ethnic minorities, they are quite sizable numbers as well. And again, contextualized to the country, this could go into the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands, maybe even the millions. Look at the Chinese population over here, 20%. I mean, that's a massive number that any government would have to deal with. Later on, we'll take a look at this as well. In fact, let's take a look at it right now. Looking at the Chinese population in Indonesia, it is pretty much the same situation as some of the other countries in Southeast Asia. The Chinese are not native to Southeast Asia. So a lot of the population that eventually settled here were because of immigration policies during the colonial period. So the Dutch, they have immigration policies as well. The Chinese were flooding in to Southeast Asia, but also to places like Indonesia. Eventually, they settled here, and you know the story about that. Now, what might also be a familiar story is that a lot of these Chinese immigrants, they were involved in the modern sectors of the economy, and a lot of them also had great financial wealth backing, networks, clan associations for financial support, that kind of stuff. So very quickly, the Chinese community group, they became associated with a higher status of wealth. I'm not saying all of them are rich, but comparatively, it was very evident, it was very visible in society that the Chinese community was just better off compared to other groups. The Chinese community was able to accumulate wealth better than other groups. The Chinese community had greater access to opportunity and wealth, that kind of stuff. It just was a very visible thing. And very quickly, this bred into an inter-ethnic jealousy, an inter-ethnic economic jealousy. Now, what made things worse is in 1949, China turned communist. So after the civil war in China finished, like the KMT, Kuomintang, and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, they fought, and eventually the CCP won out. And China turned communist in 1949. What effect this has on the immigrant Chinese across Southeast Asia is that for some countries like in Indonesia, they became associated with the communists. And of course, in that era and in that context, there is a negative association when you associate with the communists. So not only is there now economic jealousy, but towards the Chinese population in Indonesia, there is this level and degree of suspicion, and I would say even hostility. So it was a really complicated time for the Chinese community in Indonesia. And the last point over here, citizenship laws. Basically, what you don't need to know too much about this, but basically they were kind of like forced to choose what kind of which country they wanted to belong to, and that added like other layers of complications as well. But basically, the idea here is that there is a lot of mistrust, or there is a lot of jealousy, there is a lot of tension. I think the point is between the local population and the immigrant Chinese population. Now, thinking about national unity, when Sukarno came into power, when he came into his appointment as leader of Indonesia, actually what happened was that he, as a response to this kind of thing, and also kind of like from his own personal suspicions and his own personal mistrust of China. Like Sukarno is someone who mistrusted China on a personal level because he was always fearful of China competing with him for influence in Southeast Asia. Sukarno was a very ambitious guy, and he had his sights on Southeast Asia, not to conquer or what lah, but like to have that influence. And he was worried that China would have that kind of competition to him as well. So all these things fed together, right? On the mass level, you have these kind of inter-ethnic tensions. On the elite level, the leader himself has a degree of mistrust towards this particular community. And so with that kind of attitude, definitely you can expect that assimilationist policies, coercive policies, discriminatory policies, they are going to be enacted against this community. So what you have over here, Chinese legislation, and it kind of like targeted the Chinese community. It set a lot of restrictions for them, and it kind of even excluded them from certain things within the economic sphere, within education, things like that. And there were even points of violence where, in 1965, if you all remember the coup, the Chinese community was targeted once again. Even though they had really nothing much to do with the coup, but because they had this association with the PKI, the communists, and the communists were blamed for the coup. So it was a guilty by association kind of thing. I know it all sounds really indirect and really complicated, but I just want you to get the idea that in Indonesia at that point in time, it was just so easy to make the Chinese community the scapegoat. And that is a real reflection of the state of national unity at that point in time with this particular group. Clearly, there are a lot of elements of disunity that are present over here. And in the initial stages of Indonesia with this community, there are many issues lah, and it is a very unstable situation. Okay, but that's with one community group, and in particular the Chinese community group. But I think Indonesia is concurrently facing a lot of other problems, and these are quite severe as well. In fact, I would argue that these are even more severe than their relations with the Chinese community at that point in time. The next issue that we have to think about is this word that you see over here called provincialism. The idea here basically is what I've been talking about quite often, is that there is this tension between the political center in Java, which is Jakarta, and the outer islands, which is basically everything else. So there is a lot of lack of understanding between Java and the outer islands, but I think there is a lot of fear as well from the outer islands as to what intentions Java might have for Indonesia. So keep in mind, guys, that Indonesia, as we know it right now, is a new creation, right? It is a constructed state. Many of these outer islands never functioned or were never subsumed under Java before. There wasn't that kind of political arrangement, but now they found themselves in it being a new country, being within a single unit of territory. So for them, right, naturally there will be this kind of fear, because for them there is this dominant population, and you don't really know what that dominant population has in plan for the country, has in plan for your minority groups and things like that. So there is this fear of Javanese domination on a political level, because we are looking at power concentrated in the Javanese population, in the political center in Jakarta, and very little power decentralized, or very little power dispersed to various groups across the entire country. Then there's another fear of cultural erosion, because if Javanese is going to be the standard marker for identity, if Javanese is going to be the standard marker for national identity, then what's going to happen to all the other unique cultures and characteristics of the minority groups spread across Indonesia? Are they going to be given a space of accommodation, or are they going to be alienated and slowly eroded away? That kind of fear was very present, and that kind of tension between Java and the outer islands was very, very obvious. And later on, I'm going to give you some extreme examples on point 3 over here, which is that for some of these, it didn't just remain at a point of tension. It actually escalated into active violence, and it actually even radicalized their political objectives. In the past, or at the start, it may have been a tension point. Then it may have been them demanding for more independence, or maybe them demanding for cultural preservation of their own identities. But once all these things, the fear continued to build. Once all these things was not guaranteed or anything like that, then they got pushed to the extreme, and you get full-blown separatism, or you get a full-blown insurgency. And these kind of things, once it begins, is super, super difficult to stop. And in fact, some of the insurgencies that we will talk about today continue on today, like in 2020. So, that's the kind of severity. It's kind of like what we saw in Burma, right? Indonesia, to a degree, has those kind of problems even till today as well. So the first one has to do with this province called Aceh. If I could just refer you back to the Indonesia map over here, you can just refer it on your slides. Aceh, you can see, is right at the left top tip of Indonesia. So you can see the word ACEH over there, Aceh. So you can see that that's where the hotbed of separatism and insurgency is. It is, to me lah, it is no coincidence that it is the furthest point away from Java. You can see it's like all the way at the top of Sumatra. So that kind of geographical distance can actually also translate into political distance or ethnic distance or national identity distance. That kind of stuff. Like space can be translated into many forms. And later on, you will see that the other case study that I will briefly touch upon is the separatism in East Timor. And East Timor, on this map right now, they didn't particularly identify it, but you see in the bottom, there is this cluster called East Nusa Tenggara. So East Timor is somewhere around there, but same thing, I want to point out that kind of geographical distance can actually lead to a very loose political control over these territories, and it could also lead to very loose identification with the country because they're just so far away and it's just so hard to have that consistency of controlling them. Now with Aceh, the separatism actually began quite early. You can see there 3 years, 4 years after Indonesian independence, it already kind of like began and it was full blown. So you have an Acehnese rebellion 1953 to 1959. This was when Sukarno was in power. Sukarno actually gave the territory a special territory status, which basically mean that they have some autonomy to kind of decide some things for themselves lah. But they would still be subsumed under the federal government in Jakarta, in Java. So there is still that kind of political hierarchy that is going on even with that. So naturally, these people in Aceh, especially those that are really radicals, right? They are not happy with this kind of situation, and they constantly feel a sense of threat from Java, and they also feel a sense of like a lack of identity lah between. So they don't have that kind of connection or that sense of belonging and stuff. So 1976, the Free Aceh movement began, and it reached a point in time where it got so intense that they unilaterally, in a sense, declared independence for themselves. Of course, like this is not valid and all that kind of stuff. It's more like a political statement, but nonetheless, they did it. It's a really good indicator and illustration of an act of national disunity, and this is a clear statement of disunity and separatism lah, in that sense. 1980s, the troops sent in to manage security threat and the separatist tendencies over there. So you can see that kind of military element coming in. At this point in time, I just want to kind of reinforce the idea and kind of to emphasize this point that assimilation, this national unity policy, this social policy of assimilation, it doesn't necessarily imply military action. Okay, it doesn't necessarily imply military action. So under the philosophy of assimilation, technically and theoretically there isn't military action included in that. But in Southeast Asia, when we study how assimilation was applied, many countries like Indonesia, like Burma, they did attach that military element to assimilation. So in the implementation, how governments saw the policy, how they conceptualized it, how they implemented it, sometimes they could take it further down the extreme. And usually in this case, it means that there is some level of physical conflict or physical violence involved, usually with military action, insurgency, guerrilla warfare, that kind of stuff. So again, these are all very visual indicators that there is a level of disunity going on over there. Even in Suharto's time, the Aceh movement, continued to pose a threat and to pose a level of instability to Indonesia. Suharto's initial New Order regime emphasized on unity and conformity. So that's assimilationist style. Anyone opposed to Pancasila is the national ideology, was branded a communist or an Islamic extremist. Nations and governments like to do this kind of stuff where they set about a set of principles, in this case Pancasila, and anyone opposed to this set of principles will be branded as an enemy of the state. Once these people are branded as an enemy of the state, the government can literally do anything to them because they are justified, or they are legitimately seen to do so. It is in the name of the nation, it is in the name of the people, it is in the name of security, that kind of stuff. So this gives the Indonesian government a lot more power, a lot more legitimacy to use forceful action against disturbances such as ethnic separatism and insurgency. So that's something to consider, as well as how governments can take assimilation to the extreme. 1983, Pancasila becomes the sole official ideological principle, so it just reinforces that idea that you are either with us or against us. Java imposed policies, and therefore that increases the tension between the center and the periphery. Every time when the government makes an announcement or sets out a policy or debates, parliament, all that kind of stuff, it happens in Java. And the decisions made in Java and in Jakarta are going to disseminate, they're going to permeate throughout the entire archipelago, throughout the entire country. So from the perspective of the minorities living in all these other areas, right, they are seeing policy come out of Jakarta, and they are the recipients of that, whether or not it's going to be a positive thing or a negative thing, a constructive thing or destructive thing. Kind of like they see themselves as passive recipients. They're powerless in that sense to do anything about it. And so for some of them, the only response is to hit back hard, to go into radicalism, to fight back, and not to lay over, that kind of stuff. So that's how this kind of tensions can escalate. So negative consequences of the assimilationist policy. You have riots. There are a lot of other spillover effects as well. There are the movement of peoples, and that creates tension that really dislocates a lot of people from their native land, and move them elsewhere, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of economic disparities that are going on. So like what we discussed in Burma, you have a more developed center, but the periphery may be left underdeveloped. And that remains the situation even as the country prospers or develops. And then, of course, we have the most extreme movements, which are the separatist movements we see in Aceh and East Timor. So the Aceh separatism, it kind of goes on and on, even till today, actually, to some degree. And then you can see that there is an increased military aspect to this conflict, to this separatism. Aceh was legislated into a special combat zone, and that kind of gives you an idea of how worsened or how severe the situation is over there. That why they give this kind of terms to places is such that they change the rules of engagement, which means to say that if you term somewhere a special combat zone, probably it means that you can use any means necessary or many means necessary to control the threat over there. And usually this involves firearms and brutal force, that kind of stuff. So it just again gives you that indicator or the evidence of what's going on over there, and the relation to national unity. And of course, the management of such an issue would largely fall on the Indonesian army. But again, I want you to think from the minorities' perspective. In this case, think from the Acehnese perspective, and you see Indonesian troops coming from Java and coming to your land and like trying to enforce the situation and stuff like that. I mean, it can go both ways lah, but I think one of the ways that it can go is you feel an even greater sense of threat, or you feel an even greater sense of injustice, coming from that. So that's something you want to think about. East Timor, it was kind of the same thing, except that I think that this one had a different outcome. So East Timor, long story short, is a very complicated history, but it was only decolonized in 1975 by Portugal, actually. So what happened is that East Timor went back to Indonesia, but there was some disagreement as to whether that should have happened or not. Anyway, it went on and on and on until um, somewhere in 1999 there was a referendum being implemented over there, and kind of like they asked the people lah, like do you want to remain under the Indonesian nation and state, or do you want to form your own country? I think the results are quite obvious, but I think there was some complication over there. Anyway, East Timor today is a independent country by itself. It's called Timor Leste, and but that kind of occurs outside of your syllabus. So actually, by the end of your syllabus, in 2000, the East Timor separatism movement is still going on. It's a good pairing case study to Aceh, um, to showcase that kind of disunity within Indonesia. What happened to the Chinese community though? I mean, I left it quite early on, but I think with the Chinese community, it gives you a kind of a contrast case study, because when we see the Chinese community under the Suharto era, actually there was a reversal of fortunes. I think that Suharto really applied a good level of more integrationist policies towards the Chinese compared to Sukarno. And because he really saw the potential of the wealth of the Chinese population, and he really wanted to tap into that, and he saw that this community could really be quite beneficial to himself and to the country as well. So there was a reversal of policy for the Chinese community, and they were really in a sense more integrated into society. I wouldn't say on a very deep level, because I can see that it was superficial and it was very tied to economics specifically. So in terms of that emotional element, I really don't know if it was there. In terms of the identity element, I really don't know whether it was there. Um, and another piece of evidence to kind of give you about the fortunes of the Chinese community is that when another crisis hit, and this was in 1997, once again the Chinese population in many areas of the country became the scapegoat. Like, they were blamed for the crisis, they were blamed for causing like situations. A lot of that economic jealousy came back again, which suggests that this underlying tension that was present in the Sukarno era, even no matter what Suharto did, didn't really address the core issues, and that tension between the ethnic groups continue to remain. Now, this is a really, really great case study to show how ethnic tensions can remain undercurrent for many, many years. In fact, this is decades, because from the last kind of like Chinese related ethnic clashes to 1997 in the Asian financial crisis, that's at least about 3 decades or so. So that it just goes to show you how ethnic tensions can be really deep rooted and deep seated. And another big lesson over here is to show you that sometimes integrationist policies may not work if implemented in an unsound manner, or implemented in a disingenuous manner, or implemented with too many conditions or too many specific criteria to fulfill, and so on and so forth. So it kind of felt that the Indonesia situation with the Chinese population over here, I mean, you can argue that it was more integrated and it was more inclusivist. Okay, I can give you that lah. But I don't know whether or not within the time frame of our study was there that genuine kind of forging of a commonality and a relationship between the locals and the Chinese population. So that's something for you to discuss. I think definitely now in Indonesia the situation is much better compared to what it was. But again, we are studying history, so let's focus on like what happened back then. So that's why I say Indonesia is a really complicated case study, because you see at the end of it, right? I presented to you like there are certain major issues, and there are certain groups of people who really act out and in a very visible manner shows national disunity. But at the same time, there are many, the country is still intact, and many of the other minority groups and ethnic groups and so on and so forth, they continue to live under this arrangement without that kind of response that we see in Aceh and East Timor. Even the Chinese themselves, actually, they are not the ones that are agitating for change, or they are not the ones that are becoming radicalized. So there's that kind of accommodation spirit from the minorities as well. And I really want to highlight this point that sometimes in national unity calculations, whether or not a country has achieved national unity or not, sometimes it really has to do with the minority attitudes as well. Rather than just talking about government policy over government policy over government policy, I really want you all to consider minority attitudes as well. How do they receive government policy? How do they react to it? Because that could be a major component in that equation of national unity that I think can make all the difference as well lah. And the last complexity to Indonesia is that you take a look at the kind of national unity policies that they implement. It's kind of like neither here nor there, or maybe more specifically, it's like there's one type of policy for a certain type of group, there's another type of policy for another type of group, there's an overarching national policy. There's so many layers to their policy. Is it that clean? Is it that simplistic or one-dimensional in that, oh, Indonesia under Sukarno is pursuing an integrationist policy? Oh, Indonesia under Sukarno was pursuing an assimilationist policy. Seems like Indonesia is quite complex because they have that kind of gray area kind of situation. So I leave it up to you, man. This one I'm just presenting to you the complexity, arguments wise, points wise. Read the notes, try to decipher it, and come to your own conclusions for yourself. Because everyone is entitled to their own opinion for this. Now, the next case study is Malaysia, and quite similar to, okay, so Malaysia is demographically quite similar to Indonesia, but Malaysia is policy-wise a bit closer to what we saw with the Singapore set of policies. So, trying to make the connections as you listen to the Malaysia case and decide upon the groupings for yourself, because again, honestly, all these kind of comparative analysis groupings, it will be entirely up to you how you want to form your clusters of case studies. Just want to remind you that Malaysia is made up of West Malaysia, the one that we typically think about. We drive up and we go to JB or Kuala Lumpur or Ipoh or Malacca, Penang, okay, that's West Malaysia. And then we have East Malaysia, which typically we associate with Sabah, Sarawak, that kind of stuff. So, I just want you to keep in mind that Malaysia is two separate territories, and I don't really go too much into it, but there is also a divide in terms of identity between West Malaysians and East Malaysians. So you go around school, and I do know some like teachers and maybe even more than teachers who have relatives or who came from Malaysia, and some of them actually come from East Malaysia. You can go and ask them, how do they identify themselves? Actually, some of them who come from Sarawak will tell you that, oh, I'm from Sarawak, rather than, oh, I'm from Malaysia. Or they'll tell, like, I am Sarawakan. I don't know. Oh, man, I'm so ashamed. I don't know what they call themselves, but Sarawakan, okay, maybe. Or like Sabah people. Oh my god, what do you call them? Sabahnese. Oh man, I gotta go find this out. So go around school and ask them how to pronounce, and ask them what do they call themselves, and then you can report back to me. Cool. So, demographically speaking, very much like Singapore. Also a legacy of immigration. You see the Chinese and the Indian populations there, but the native group over there will be the Malay community. The percentage wise 53%, but you can see the Chinese population is quite large as well, 35%. This is 1970. I think it's more or less like quite like not drastically different lah, right, from 1970 till today. While the four kind of groups are more or less similar to what we see in Singapore, but the percentages are quite different. You can see that over here, even though we have a majority group, but the majority is not as majority as what we see in Singapore or actually in Burma or maybe even like what we saw in Java just now, because the minority group, quote unquote, the Chinese population, they are quite sizable in numbers and in percentage as well. So there is that a bit of a differentiation or nuance with the Malaysia case study as compared to Singapore. So kind of like try not to equate them exactly the same as well, even though we are more or less dealing with the same ethnic groups. Now, in Malaysia, I think quite like Singapore, it largely falls under, okay lah, spoiler alert, like I think it largely falls under the integration approach, quite like Singapore, among the three major races. But I don't think in Malaysia we are dealing with ethnic equality. That's because in Malaysian ethnic management, in their social policy and their politics, there is a special status group of people, the Bumiputra policies, and because of these policies, because there are special statuses or special privileges afforded to the sons of the soil, as what Bumiputra means, there can never be that true equality of opportunity or equality among the races lah. At least at that point in time, I don't think that was a possibility given these kind of politics. So what in fact we should be trying to understand the Malaysia case study by is by this term over here that you see, a quid pro quo. So it's not so much an equality but a consensus. And in this term you see quid pro quo, which means to say that everyone understands that the Malays in Malaysia have a special place. And in fact, this is enshrined in their constitution, political primacy of the Malays, section 153, special position of Malays, all these kind of things, they're like enshrined in the constitution. Kind of like no matter whether you are from that group or from the minority groups, you kind of acknowledge that that exists and that is part of the arrangement in Malaysia. So the question isn't about trying to topple that or like trying to reform that, but it's about getting to the consensus, recognizing that, okay, that is the situation, but can we find a consensus arrangement that can create harmony between the Malay majority group and the minority groups? So that really became the kind of politics that characterized Malaysia, is trying to find that balance between the accordance of special status versus the accommodation and the opportunities given to the minority groups as well. So that is the dynamics that is going on. But as you can probably tell, that is the source of tension as well. Probably the fault lines are going to be around that kind of communal racial kind of politics. So kind of like in return for the minority groups seeing and accepting these the special status of the Malays, in return, the quid pro quo means that in return you are given something lah. And what they're given is the Chinese and the Indians and the minority groups. They are given citizenship rights and they are given the freedom of action in the economic sphere. So basically they can conduct their business lah, which is honestly what they're interested in doing. So they go about doing that, and plus they get citizenship rights. So in a sense, they get some degree of political power as well. Of course, not to the same level as the dominant group, but still something is something. There are further elements to Malaysia politics that tries to represent its races well and to try to strike that consensus and try and strike that balance. The dominant party in Malaysia is actually the Alliance Party, and the Alliance Party is an umbrella party that is made out of three separate organizations: UMNO, which is representing Malay community, then MCA, which is representing Chinese community, and then MIC, which is representing the Indian community. So you can see that in that dominant party, it isn't a Malay party per se. Like, they don't package themselves as something like that. But the Alliance Party, the word alliance, right, it kind of like suggests that there is some attempt at balancing of racial interests and communal politics within Malaysia. At that point in time, Tunku Abdul Rahman, he was a well-respected leader by all races. So kind of like in that figure of Aung San in Burma, people could trust him no matter which ethnic group that you're from. Tunku Abdul Rahman was the man, who's the man, the man that people looked at. And there was kind of a stable consensus at that point in time. But as time wore on, remember that Malaysia gets independence in 1957, and as time wears on into the 1960s and all that, there's a new generation of leaders, and even the population themselves, the political mood changes a bit, somewhat. You don't really need to go into that, but it changes somewhat. And the consensus that the old leaders forged in the 50s and at independence and all that, right? It's not say that it was forgotten, but they also shifted their political attitudes towards these kind of dynamics lah. Once again, quite like what we saw in Indonesia, economic jealousy was one of the big contributing factors to the build-up of tensions between the ethnic groups. There's other things to do with education as well, but I really think it came down once again to Chinese economic strength and the kind of wealth accumulation with the Chinese community compared against the Malay community. So there was this source of tension that stemmed from an economic reason over there in Malaysia. What really escalated issues is when political parties politicize it. And so we have the emergence of radical groups like PAS, like Pan-Malaysian Islamic Party, and they really run on this agenda of communal politics, and they play up this kind of like very deep animosities between racial groups, in this case like the Malays and the Chinese and all that. So long story short, snowball until in May 13, 1969, there was another explosion of racial riots in Malaysia, and this is on a scale that the country has really never seen before. In the 50s and the 60s, there were ethnic clashes, but nothing to this scale, and it was really quite bad between the Malay group and the Chinese group, to the point where Malaysia had to, in a sense, suspend democracy, and they had to convene this thing called the National Operations Council, if I remember correctly, NOC, and in a sense, it's like a martial law period where Malaysia was governed by the NOC. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the damage and the scale of the ethnic relations and the deterioration of that into a full-blown eruption like this lah. So yeah, I don't know if you know about this, but when I found out about this, I was like, whoa, I didn't even know this happened, and it was such a big thing in Malaysian politics. So that provoked a lot of change because clearly the Malaysian leaders and the people never wanted to see something like this again. So they began thinking about their social policies and how better to reform it, how better to adjust it so that you prevent something like this from happening again. So there were a lot of things that came about from a national ideology where it emphasized a lot more universal values and commonalities that we can see across ethnic groups, that kind of stuff where bind people together from different contexts. There were some legal measures and so on and so forth. But I think going into the crux of the issue, which was economic, the Malaysian government instituted this thing called the New Economic Policy, NEP, sometime I think in 1971, where it sought to redress the imbalances of economic standing across the ethnic groups, particularly for the Malay population. So they wanted to reduce and eradicate poverty for all Malaysians. And again, this I think is very specifically, the Malay group will stand to benefit from this the most. So it was meant to alleviate and to bring their status up lah, a bit. And also to restructure Malaysian economic structures to prevent associations of wealth with race and that kind of stuff. So try to rebalance the whole thing a bit lah. Was it a success? Economically speaking, I have my doubts. I don't know if the NEP was such a great success that it really spurred Malaysia onto greater heights. I think there are other reasons for that. I don't think it's attributed to the NEP. But in terms of national unity, I think that NEP, even though it's an economic policy, it did a lot of good to national unity, ethnic relations within the country, because it really dealt with the core issues. And I really want to highlight and focus on this point and even draw a contrast to what we said about Indonesia earlier. Sometimes integrationist policy doesn't work, especially when it doesn't deal with the core of the issues. But over here you can see integrationist policies, when it is targeted, when it deals with the core of the issues, you can see that the effects can be quite long lasting and sustainable, and it can really redress like the tensions that you see between ethnic groups. So again, the big lesson here, policy in theory versus policy in implementation, draw the differences and use that to your advantage in your arguments. So outcomes, for Malaysia, after 1969, there are no other incidents of large-scale ethnic clashes since then. There may be small ones, but I'm not too sure about that. But there were no large-scale ones. They kind of went back to that equilibrium, that stability of that consensus across ethnic groups. The Malay government consistently wins at the poll. What I mean by this is that, just now I talked to you about the Alliance Party, and the Alliance Party has 3 component parties, but clearly UMNO is the dominant one. And the fact that at that point in time, UMNO keeps getting voted back into power. The Prime Minister is always from the Malay community group. I mean, it does give an idea of what the majority of the population feels about this situation, that this is a continuous trend. And so there isn't really that big animosity towards any particular group, especially not towards the Malay group or a Malay leader. So that gives you an idea of how stable the national unity or ethnic relations are within that country. And last point here, Malaysian national identity accessible for all races, meaning to say that you can perform Malaysianness, if you want to call it that. So give an example, let's say there's that multiculturalism element for Malaysian identity. So you can retain your unique identities. Like in Malaysia, you can still celebrate Chinese New Year. You still talk in your dialect, and so on and so forth. So there is that kind of multiculturalist spirit over there, and it allows access for all races to feel Malaysian in that sense. There isn't that great prejudice, even though there is that special status, the Bumiputra policies. There is still that in effect. That hasn't changed, and I don't think it will ever change. But even despite that, can there still be some level of consensus? It seems like after 1969, there could have been. But again, I leave it up to you to decipher it for yourself. Okay, so I'm done with Indonesia and Malaysia. Hopefully gives you insight into these 2 case studies a bit more. Tutorials. Now, for tutorials this week, same thing like last week. I didn't get to go through Thailand and Philippines, and I really want to do them because they are complex case studies and there are no easy answers over there. So for tutorials this week, same thing. I want to focus on Thailand and Philippines. The essential question there is the same 2 big questions we had here. What kind of approaches did they have over there, and did it change over time? Number 2, was national unity achieved in those 2 case studies? So these are the questions that I hope you guys can prepare a bit for, and then in tutorials we'll discuss them. Okay, cool. DJ Anesh out.